what we're experiencing is a made-in-Canada inflationary crisis. The more this Prime Minister spends, the more things cost. It's been referred to as just inflation. And the proposals that the government's bringing forward won't address this inflation, and in fact are going to add to the inflationary pressures that Canadians are facing. Their inflationary deficits are driving up taxes, and they're driving up costs at the fastest rate in more than my lifetime. Year over year inflation is higher than it's been in 40 years. Now, for 2 years, Conservatives have been warning the government, been warning this Liberal government about the consequences of their actions and how much it would hurt Canadians. And that's hurting Canadians right across our country. Now, what we've heard from this government this week is not the announcement of a dental plan. We heard a plan that the Liberals have concocted that's going to satisfy part of the deal with their coalition partner in the NDP to keep them in power, to prop them up. It's another example of the Prime Minister failing to meet his promises, all the while printing more cash and borrowing more money that's going to stoke inflation. I'd like to note for everyone following the debate and for honourable members in this House that dental care programs for low-income children exist in all provinces and territories save for Manitoba and the Northwest Territories, in addition to the 70% of Canadians who already have coverage. Now, it's important that we look after the health care of Canadians. And they've been doing this thing in Canada for a long time. Again, it goes back to before I was born, where health care was a provincial responsibility. It was solely the jurisdiction of the provinces. So if there's a plan to meet with the premiers to discuss health care, and the Prime Minister wants to do that, the premiers will be delighted. And I hear the parliamentary secretary to the government House leader wants to contribute to the debate, and I hope that when he arises in questions and comments that he's prepared to tell this House and tell all Canadians that the Prime Minister is going to answer the call that the premiers have been making for 2 years to meet with them to discuss the state of health care in Canada. Now, if he did meet with them, if the Right Honourable Prime Minister found his way to that meeting, he would hear that they're not looking for a dental care program. That's not what the provinces are asking for right now. Now, if the Prime Minister is considering another line of work and interested in running to be a provincial premier, I'm sure that he can explore those job openings. He can check out Indeed and see what's available. I hear that their sister party in Ontario is looking for someone, and perhaps the member for Papineau could find a spot in Ontario. Now, this promise is only more inflationary spending, and it's not a dental care program, and it's outside the jurisdiction of the federal government, and the level of government that's responsible is not looking for the federal government to execute on it. They've also talked about, these Liberals have talked about housing, and it's so interesting because Canadians could be confused, and I think that might be intentional, that the government's looking to confuse them because the Liberals love to talk about how much they've spent on housing. No government has ever spent more on housing than these Liberals, they'll tell you. Well, if we measured success by how much they spent and not by how many houses got built, they would be the international galactic champions of housing. But unfortunately, what we've seen is the doubling of house prices under these Liberals. And what's the result of that? 30-year-olds living in 400 square foot apartments that they're paying $2,300 a month for, if they can find an apartment, and if not, they're living in mom or dad's basement, and their dreams of home ownership are slipping away if they haven't been crushed already. In Vancouver, it's $2,600 a month in rent. In Toronto, $2,300 a month in rent. And the inflationary spending checks, that we'll call them, 6 in 10 Canadians aren't going to qualify for them. So the few renters who do see that $500 one-time boost, which represents less than a week of rent in the average housing unit in Toronto or Vancouver, are simply going to ask, what's next? Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad you asked, what's next? What's next is, because they've pumped more money into the economy, they've created more inflation, and we've heard this from big banks, from economists, that what they're doing is inflationary. It's going to diminish the value of every dollar that they earn, including those checks, those checks that they just received. So they're not going to go as far. And that, of course, doesn't speak to the fact that we're now going to have to pay interest on the money that they borrowed to send those checks that are going to diminish their spending power. So it's a terrible situation that they're perpetuating. And there are solutions, and I look forward to sharing those with you as we move through this conversation today. But what is it that we need to solve? Well, first, let's take a look at one of the major pain points that Canadians are feeling every month: food prices. 10% food inflation is what Canadians are facing right now. It's the fastest that it's been up in over 40 years. Now, what does that look like for the average Canadian family? Well, it's between $1,200 and $2,000 more per year that they're spending on groceries. An extra $2,000 haircut that they're taking before they even spend a dollar. And on what items is this having a dramatic effect? Butter is up 16.9%, eggs 10.9%, fish 10.4%, 17.6% for breads, pasta 32%, fresh fruit up 13%, oranges up 18.5%, coffee 14.2%. The list goes on and on. Let them eat soup, they might say, up 19.2%. So while Canadians are struggling just to put food on the table for their families, furnaces are clicking on across the country as we speak. As the mercury drops, people are going to look to heat up their homes. We live in one of the world's coldest climates. Heating is not a luxury here. Just like for many folks in rural and remote communities, driving your car, your truck, it's not a luxury. You need, it's part of how you have to live, to get to work, to get to doctor's appointments, to get groceries. And the carbon tax is punishing Canadians for a behavior that the government says is bad, that it should be discouraged. We need to correct it. And they're going to tell us, Speaker, in their questions and comments, oh, but the member is forgetting about the money that they send back. The Parliamentary Budget Officer has already said that the claims the government makes that Canadians get more back than they pay in some kind of weird Ponzi scheme that they've cooked up, it doesn't work. It's just that. It's a scheme. Canadians are not getting more back than they pay in. They are worse off. And emissions go up. Tree planting from the government has stayed the same. That is, that they're not planting any, but they promised to. So you would expect, though, Canadians would expect that when Canadians are feeling that pain, the carbon tax is going up, that the price of food is going up. Well, what else could the government do? Well, they're going to increase taxes on your paycheck in January of this coming year. There's no break in sight for Canadians. And they'll say, oh, it's not a tax. Speaker, let's get real here. If it looks like a tax, and it sounds like a tax, and Canadians take home less money at the end of the month, it's a tax. And that's exactly what these Liberals are proposing. For January 1st. For January 1st. And so I hear some excitement coming from those joining us from home, Speaker. Canadians are rising up. You can hear it in the House of Commons that they've had enough. That they're at a breaking point with these prices. And all the while, the job creators, the makers in our communities, not takers, makers, are small businesses. You hear it all the time. They're the backbone of our economy. I couldn't agree more. Well, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business reports that 1 in 6 businesses are considering closing their doors. 62% of small businesses are still carrying debt from the pandemic. So we have this risky situation that the government has created, that they're perpetrating on Canadians, where everything is more expensive to do business, more expensive to feed your family, more expensive to get to work. These hard times that have come, they don't need to be this way. But following an election that was called really to exploit the divisions that had been created in a very cynical move by the Prime Minister, resulted in a parliament where a coalition needed to be cooked up so that the government could stay in power. So Canadians aren't seeing that real relief. What does that look like? Seniors have to delay their retirements. That home ownership we talked about, it's disappearing because they don't have any time to dream about home ownership. They're too busy trying to come up with the money to pay their $2,600 a month rent. People are worried. Conservatives, we're offering hope for Canadians. It's a big contrast to what they've seen from the government, particularly over the last year. We're going to focus on Canadians' paychecks. Make sure that they're able to take home that money that they work so hard to earn. We're going to focus on making sure that taxes aren't going up. It's not very difficult because we know that anyone who doesn't run a deficit in their home every month has to make choices about what they're able to put in their monthly budget. Add something, you have to take something away. So if the government's going to propose new spending, well, what are they going to stop doing so that they can afford it, so that Canadians can afford it? Heard a very interesting line during the last 2 years from this government. It's that they've taken on debt so that Canadians don't have to. I do have some news, Speaker. You heard it here first, and that's that the debt is borne by Canadians. And they'll tell you that, well, interest rates have never been lower. Oh, wait. That's not the case. We now see interest rates on the march. So it's not free money. and Canadians are going to have to pick up the tab for it. So we're going to need a government. Canadians need to see a light at the end of the tunnel that promises some hope. We're going to have to scrap the old way that this government has been doing things. We're going to have to look at what it is that Canadians really need. Well, they need to be able to heat their homes, feed their families, and dream that they're going to be able to do better than the generation before them. But that's not what's been put on offer by this government. So lower taxes, that seems like something that I'd hope we could all agree on. Making sure that everyone can afford a home, not just spending a lot and calling that a housing plan. I would hope that that's something that we can all agree on. And addressing the root cause of what's driving this inflation in Canada so that people aren't experiencing this crushing inflation on their food. And even when global inflation starts to recede, let's say next year it's 5%. Let's say it's 5%. They're still paying 5% more on the 10% that it went up the year before. It's time to stop the damage that's being done. And we hear often that it's a global phenomenon that they've had no control over. Well, instead of throwing your hands up and saying, well, it's pretty bad everywhere else and we're kind of better than the other guys, that is cold comfort to people across this to people across this country. Because whether you live in Victoria by the Sea, Prince Edward Island, or Victoria, British Columbia, or Victoria, Nunavut, that word salad doesn't fill bellies. And it's getting a lot tougher to do that as food prices continue to march up. They need to see action, not excuses from the government. So what's that action going to be? I really hope that their plan isn't just higher taxes. I really hope that their plan isn't borrowing more money and dumping it into a housing plan that's not building more homes. They're driving up the prices. So, Speaker, we're going to focus on Canadians. We're going to focus on their paychecks. We're going to focus on their dreams of home ownership. We're going to focus on their retirement. Because that's what we're all, that's the dream that we all have. And that's the dream that when other people come to this country, that they have. And we want to keep that dream alive. So, Speaker, what the government's proposing today, it's not help. It's a distraction. It's just more from a government. It's more from a government, and it sounds like the member who's joining in is as upset with the government as I am.
We all are.
Can't even seem to afford gas to come into the House of Commons today. So Speaker.
Point of order from the Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Well, as this very experienced member would know, he talks a lot in the House, Mr. Speaker, that we should not refer to the presence or absence of anybody in the House by suggesting that the member couldn't afford to get here in person certainly would at the very least indicate that the individual is not here.
Thank you very much. What I will say on this one, though, is for those of us who have to join on Zoom, to make sure that we leave our microphones off unless we're intervening in the discussion at hand. The Honourable Member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes.
Well, thank you, Speaker. it doesn't seem like even with new made-up parliamentary secretary roles, they have enough people over there to be able to get everybody together and get them briefed up that it's safe for them to come back to work. So they can do that. We'll help that member out so he can afford gas. We're going to help Canadians afford more by ending the carbon tax, ending the paycheck tax. We want to help Canadians, give them hope and not fear, and that's what this government's been peddling. Thanks so much.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable government or the honourable parliamentary secretary to the government House Leader.